Welcome to Help Me I'm Poor, the money podcast that's more couples reunion than credit score. I'm Ellie.
And I'm Claire, and each week we discuss how money shows up in our favourite pop culture, from the classic to the nostalgic to the contemporary. If you enjoy this episode, please do rate, review and subscribe. It's really, really helpful. You can also track us down on social media at Help Me I'm Poorcast, where you can tell us what you'd like us to cover in future episodes, give us your opinions, etc.
So today we are diving into the world of reality TV, and we're going to talk all about Love is Blind. So let's get into it.
Now, you are leading on this week's episode, Ellie, because I am very patchy when it comes to reality TV. Some shows I absolutely love. Some shows I have completely passed me by. But Love is Blind is so interesting when it comes to money. I think this whole thing around setting up a life with someone, money is such an important part of that, but it gets missed out of the conversation so much. So I'm really, really interested to get into this.
So just to set the scene for anybody that hasn't seen Love is Blind, I don't know where they have been, but I am a big fan of these reality TV shows because I think there's so much that it kind of shines a spotlight on when it comes to just human behavior. But the basic premise is, can you fall in love with a stranger sight unseen? And the way it operates is that you have the couples in pods and they are there for 10 days and they basically talk to each other through these walls and ask whatever they want, build these relationships. And at the end of the 10 days, if they decide that they think that they want to build a life together, then they propose. And after the proposal, they then have the meeting. So they actually see each other for the first time after that proposal. And there's a lot to get into. I think it's worth acknowledging that we only see a very short amount. So typically in each season, then we only really get 2 to 3 episodes of the pods, which is 10 days worth of conversation. And where the juicy stuff does tend to come out is after they've actually met.
Yeah.
Although I do think it's really interesting that in the UK season, which is what we're going to be talking about, then we do actually see quite a few conversations that happen in these pods where things around money do come up quite early on. So things like jobs is obviously a huge one. What people do career-wise, people's values as well do tend to come up quite early. Things that are important. And it does make me wonder, actually, whether when you're in this circumstance, you get to the root of those really important issues way quicker than you would in a conventional dating relationship.
Definitely, because I think that when you're sort of removing the in-person chemistry from the situation and you're not in those heady early relationship days of just being very wrapped up in each other, you're very charmed by each other, the least sexy thing to do in that situation is to be oh, by the way, what's your credit score? Whereas if you're sort of one step removed from that situation, I'm not saying that you can't have chemistry with someone without seeing them, obviously, but I think you do get to the root of those conversations a lot quicker. And yeah, we're seeing this quite a lot. I think there are more people talking about money and relationships. I know that this is something that's a bit of a specialist subject of yours as well. But that thing about how to navigate those conversations, how early do you bring it up? Is it first date material? And also what cues can we pick up on from the other person if we're not having those discussions directly? So yeah, I think this is a really interesting take on that situation. And it's really interesting to compare those two situations, because I wonder if one's sort of slightly better than the other. I don't know.
Yeah, because I guess what is so different is that I feel like when you're in person, you obviously have this almost, I guess, social awareness of those norms. And so questions that you might want to ask, okay, so how much do you earn? You potentially feel like you're reserved or you don't want to do that because of those social norms. Whereas the environment that you're put in these pods is so, I guess, outside of anything normal that maybe it actually just removes a lot of the normality of how you would behave if you're dating with someone, because you kind of also like, what have I got to lose?
Yeah, because actually in real life, if you're sort of at that quite precarious stage of getting to know someone where you sort of feel like you don't want to set a foot wrong because you don't want to break the spell or break your bubble that you're
Yeah.
in, I really feel like asking some of those questions, you just wouldn't do it because you want to preserve what you've got in those really early days. And then when you get to the point where you're serious, you're so invested in the other person and you care about them so much that you might be sort of willing to overlook a few things, or you might sort of do the mental gymnastics to like override like a fundamental incompatibility
Yeah.
that you have in your financial attitudes. And, you know, we know that money is one of the leading causes of divorce, of separation. We know that like financial stress can be really, really hard on relationships. And not being on the same page as your partner, I think, it's sort of like a crack in the windshield, isn't it? That's only going to get worse over time. Like, you need to get Gavin from Autoglass in early doors. You need to have those conversations.
I think what is so interesting as well about the idea of, I guess, having that barrier is that you really don't have the distraction of the attraction, like you say. I think so often you're in that bubble that you mentioned, and also you can really drown out any red flags or concerns because that attraction physically is pulling you towards somebody. Whereas if you remove that, then you're really relying on everything else. And so much of everything else actually does tie in, I guess, ultimately to money in various different ways. Money, beliefs, values, approaches to things. And this brings me on to one particular scene which caused quite a fuss. It kind of kicked off a little bit online when it aired. And this is the conversation between Tom and Maria. And it was when they were on their honeymoon. And effectively, they were talking about their careers. And Maria asked Tom, "What did you think about my career when you found out that I was a makeup artist?" And his response is what kicked off, because he basically said, "Oh, I was a bit judgmental because ambition and hard work are really important to me." And there are so many things to talk about within that. But I think what was shocking to a lot of people, and obviously caveat that we know it's been edited, we know that we don't see everything, but is this really quick presumption that because her job was a makeup artist, that she was not hardworking or ambitious.
It's so gendered as well. Like, it could be any number of roles that are sort of in that sphere of something that's like practical or a service-based role. But because it's a makeup artist, I wonder if there's something cooking there as well.
Yeah.
But makeup artists are often like incredible business people. Apart from anything else, we've seen makeup artists grow huge beauty brands over the years and, you know, sell them, exit them for millions and millions of pounds. Like, I think that I can see why he caught heat for that.
Yeah. And I think it's worth just diving in a little bit about what we think or what that says about how we look for partners, and I guess our unconscious, maybe sometimes conscious views on different professions and careers. And actually, do we all carry a little bit of that?
I remember when I was at uni, I was in my final year and I was working as well. And I was in my early 20s, like very silly, started a very brief situationship with my boss at the time. And my flatmate, who was like very driven and she knew what she wanted from her life, which I did not, was like, "Claire, he like he was a lot older than me. She's like, Claire, he's 35 and he's working like as an assistant manager in a restaurant, probably like not earning very much. Like, is that really who you want as your boyfriend? And at the time, and I still sort of subscribe to this view, to be honest. So it's like, I don't care. Like, it's so exciting. And like, it was sort of those first flushes. Like, I hadn't thought about that at all. And I mean, he turned out to be a total shit. It's definitely one that I would undo if I could. But I just think it's really interesting that she had like a very set idea of the type of person, not even the type of person, the type of career that she wanted her like future partner to have. Whereas that is just something that wasn't ever important to me. And because I met my husband at university and then we graduated and we were working in the same place, and our careers have grown and changed with us in the relationship. I've never had that thing of sort of, what am I looking for? I don't know what I'd put into a dating app. I don't know what question I would ask someone else in the pods on Love is Blind. Like, I genuinely don't know. It's never been something that kind of entered my mind, because it hasn't had to be. But I wonder if I was looking for someone in my like late 20s, 30s and beyond, if it would come up. I suppose maybe it would, but I don't know how good or bad that would be. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do totally. And I think there was some data that was done around this a few years ago. So I think Tinder basically ranked through all of their various users and algorithms the most popular jobs for men and for women from the opposite gender.
Okay.
And it was really interesting actually what it pulled out, because the types of jobs that men liked women to have typically were quite gendered and were quite, I guess, service based. So things like air hostess was up there, and I have a suspicion there's probably something about the uniform in there as well. But things like nurse, things that were quite caring, maternal type of things. And then the jobs that women like for men were again quite, I guess, status driven. So things that are associated with either status or money.
Yeah. So like the whole looking for a man in
finance
thing.
And
that's so interesting.
There is an element of truth to it. So clearly not all of us are going to be in that boat, but there is a pattern. And I remember speaking to some of my friends a few years ago who were single, early 30s, about whether career is something that they think about and look at when they're going through dating apps. And they said, yeah, it is, because I think potentially, again, when you get to a certain point in life, and again, I can't really speak to it because I have been with my husband since a long time ago. But I think when you're getting to that point where you're thinking about settling down, you're thinking, okay, what do I want my life in my 30s to look like? Then people are thinking, okay, well, I need somebody to be able to at least like match my means, to be able to build that life and to be able to provide that, even if it's not a case necessarily that you want them to kind of provide for you.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily want to kind of have to change your lifestyle maybe compared to where you are and what you've built, I think. And actually, I quite appreciated how, like, to the point my friends were about that, because I think it's sometimes something that we maybe like frown upon a bit, admitting that we want somebody that earns a decent amount as a partner.
Yeah, I think that we can be a bit like reluctant to admit that could be a factor.
Yeah,
for sure. And I think also like it's easy to romanticize any situation,
especially when you are like we are in situations where we met our partners quite young, where we've grown up with them and our careers have progressed with them. I think it's also quite easy to, I guess, ignore the fact that if we were meeting someone in our mid-30s, it might be quite different.
Yeah. And I mean, it does all come down to that compatibility, doesn't it? It's not that, like you said, it's not about that horrible trope of like wanting someone to pay your way. It's about wanting someone that fits with what you want. And that's going to span across so many different things. But at the root of it all is like, how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah.
And you want someone who you're going to be able to like talk to openly about money. Because I think, again, that we're seeing a bit more discussion around like financial infidelity. You know, you need to be able to be open and have those conversations and be trusting. And I suppose that is something that Love is Blind like gives you an opportunity to do, whether or not people take that opportunity.
I would love to get your take on that issue of financial infidelity, because I think it's something that is really interesting to examine, largely because I think there's a real gendered angle to this. So what do you think about the idea of hiding money from your partner?
I think it's so interesting. So there's obviously sort of two separate elements to it. There's like hiding savings and there's hiding debt or financial difficulty. And I think that kind of with the hiding financial difficulty, I think that is something that happens incrementally. Usually is that the person who's hiding is like, I'll just fix it before I tell them about it. But then, as often happens with these things, it sort of spirals. And sometimes it can also be a case of like you both sort of have your head in the sand and you're ignoring it a bit. Maybe one person knows a bit more about it than the other one. But when it comes to like secret savings, I think it is so gendered. It's something that is encouraged in women and frowned upon in men. And I am on the fence about whether or not I think that is okay, because like if we're talking in terms of equality, obviously it's not okay that that men don't get to have like that secret stash of money and women do, like that's acceptable. But if we're talking about it from like an equity point of view, women are so much more likely to need that like fuck off fund, or Nadia Hussein called it running away money. She was being interviewed and she talked about like women having a fund of money that they can use to escape a difficult situation, basically. And that was clipped up and it went really viral because I suppose she's not necessarily the person that you expect to be talking about that, but I found it really interesting, the response to that. But because so much, domestic abuse is male to female, women are sort of, being pushed out of the workplace sometimes, I think it's interesting how that all interplays. And like I said, I'm still kind of on the fence. Like in principle, I think it should be okay for both, but also I do acknowledge that there are like good reasons why women might need a fuck off fund and men might have less need for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess the thing I can't quite wrap my head around is that I think that reasoning is sometimes relied on too heavily, in the sense that of course things can change quickly, but if you're in a stable, happy relationship and you're squirreling away this money, hiding it from your partner, should we be encouraging that? Because it's not to say that if circumstances don't change, you can't then start that fund. And I appreciate that you can't necessarily build it up as quickly as, if you've been doing it for a long time. But I guess the thing that makes me uncomfortable about that is that if you're doing that from day one, are you not all in the relationship? Is it, and again, people will say maybe it's just, being realistic because lots of marriages end in divorce. But I think you're probably more likely to end up in divorce if you are hiding things from your partner.
Okay, I've got a quick question for you. When you picture somebody that invests, who do you picture?
Be honest, was it a man in a suit? A Jordan Belfort type? Navy gilet on his days off, maybe?
Exactly. And that's the issue that I want to talk about. Because for too long, the world of investing has felt like it's been built for people like them, not for women like us.
Which is why we're so excited that Help Me I'm Poor is partnering with eToro on their Loud Investing initiative. It's all about raising our voices and making sure that other women see that investing is for us too.
Loud Investing was born from a simple idea. If women don't see themselves in the investing space, then they're way less likely to feel like it's something that they should or can do.
Think about it. In finance films or shows, women are usually the wives, the secretaries, the girlfriends. The men are the ones making the big money moves.
And outside finance, we're often painted as the spenders, the ones who are racking up the credit card bills. Confessions of a shopaholic, anyone?
Exactly. But it's time to flip the script because women do invest and we're good at it.
So let's talk about it. Let's be loud about it. Let's show other women from all walks of life that you don't need a finance degree or a pinstripe suit to take control of your money.
Get behind the movement. Let's make investing more visible, more inclusive, and way less Navy gilet.
Thank you so much to eToro for being our partner on Help Me I'm Poor. To find out more, head to the link in the show notes and join us in raising our voices and investing loudly.
And just a quick heads up, all content on Help Me I'm Poor is for information and educational purposes only. It should not be taken as investment or financial advice, personal recommendations, or an offer of any kind. Always do your own research.
eToro is a multi-asset investment platform. The value of your investments may go up or down. With investing, your capital is at risk.
I also sort of feel like if you're in like a happy and loving relationship, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to have a conversation of like, I've got my own savings.
Yeah.
And savings that are in your name. But I'm just really cautious of, some abusive relationships are coercive and that if a partner has that information, they might be able to get it out of you some way. So it's like a really sticky area, I think, and something that's sort of different in every relationship because the dynamics are different and people's approach to how they manage their money is just so different. Some people still keep everything separate. Some people, everything's together. And then there's lots of like shades of grey in between.
Yeah, no, totally. And I guess that is the thing. There's not going to necessarily be one approach that is suitable for everybody. But I think that is the case on both ends of the spectrum. I think that it's not always going to be the best thing to do to have money hidden from your partner. And I guess just personally, I don't feel like I would be particularly comfortable with either person doing that. And that's very different to saying that I think, we shouldn't have things in our own names because we do. We have most of our money is in one person's name or the other. And I think that is a very sensible way to have things set up, as well as the fact that we have a joint account for everyday spending. I think there's a very big difference in having money in your own name, but there being transparency about its existence versus the idea that you actually hide it and deny its existence from the person that you're, sharing your home, bed, children with.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, I think there's just so much nuance in that. And I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. Like I said, I don't know which way I fall on it. Some days I'm on one side and some days I'm on the other. But I mean, I also think that there is something about like what you each have going into the relationship as well, of like if you already have a large sum of money or you've got property or whatever going into the relationship, like do you owe the other person disclosure? At what point do you disclose that to the other person? And also like what do you do? To what degree is it okay to preserve that? Like should it become like a joint asset? And if so, at what point? Like there's so many questions around this stuff.
Yeah. And I think this is another part of the series which comes up where there was a lot of conversation around this. And I found it fascinating how people took different approaches to how they digested it. So there was a conversation about a prenup. And obviously, caveating that prenups are not legally binding in the UK in the sense that they are in the US. A prenup in the UK may be considered in a divorce, but it's up to the courts. There is no legal status to the actual document. So, with that in mind, one of the males said to his fiance that he would like a prenup in place because he had his own house, he had his own business, he had kind of funneled everything into these assets. And when he said this, she was not particularly happy about that. Her reaction was kind of shocked and a bit upset, I guess, that he would raise that. And I think there's just so much interesting to get into about that. Because I mean, what's your take on a prenup generally?
I think it's really interesting. I actually didn't know that prenups weren't legally binding in the UK. So I have always just assumed that like they are for super wealthy people anyway. And it sounds like this guy maybe has built a bit of wealth, and he's got property and stuff, but it doesn't sound like he's trying to sort of protect like an empire or like like wealth, generational wealth, or whatever it might be. But it's hard to say really, because on the one hand, I feel like you should be like all in, and if you're building life together, then surely you want to share that life with each other. But on the other hand, I'm thinking about what my attitude would be if it was her with the house and the business and she wanted to do a prenup. I think I might be like, yeah, like go team. Whereas I don't know, and I think that's like does force me to question something within myself a bit as well, of like why do I feel that way? Why do I feel like it's fair game when it's his and should be preserved when it's hers? It's really strange.
Yeah. And I don't think that's uncommon either. I think that it's not really something that we necessarily like hold the mirror up to ourselves on, but I think that a lot of us do have slightly different approaches. And I think a lot of that is probably again back to inequality and the feeling that, you know, it has been and still is harder for women to thrive financially a lot of the time. Like a lot of the systemic barriers that women have to face are harder to overcome. But I do think we have to kind of step back from all of that and actually look at, again, sometimes if we want a relationship to succeed, what are we doing to, I guess, help that or to encourage the relationship to succeed? And I mean, I think it's really interesting. I don't know many people. I know of one couple where I've heard that there was a prenup that was put in place, and that was on the request of her parents, which I understand because her parents have a lot of money and assets. And actually, in that situation, and this is not somebody that I know closely, but the husband to be was very happy to sign it because he said, you know, I understand they're just trying to protect their inheritance for their daughter, basically. And obviously, a prenup only comes into play if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
And I think keeping that in mind, I think it's interesting thinking like, would you happily sign one? Like if you met somebody nowadays and you fell for them, they came into it with huge amounts of generational wealth, would you sign it?
Yeah, probably. But I am just like such a romantic at heart. I would just be like, I really have to fight the part of myself that's like, money doesn't matter. All that matters is love. But I think, yeah, I probably would. Because I think also you're sort of, when you get married, you're taking that leap of faith, and nobody's going into it thinking that they might get divorced.
You'd hope not, at least.
Yeah, but I think also that sometimes that sentiment translates into other places that are slightly more dangerous and put women in slightly more precarious position. especially when it comes to things like if you're sort of assuming that you will stay together forever, taking time out of the workplace, like to look after children or to look after dependents in like other areas.
That's one of the reasons though why they aren't fully legally binding, is because a court would always look at that element. So in a way, even if you signed a prenup and said, you know, everything that we go into this is yours, if we get divorced in 20 years, if you have had 3 kids and you've given up your career and stayed at home, you're not going to get nothing.
Yeah. And I think I think it's really important though, because one of the things where this like really peaks, I think, is around pensions.
Yeah.
So please don't all fall asleep at once because I've referred to pensions. I promise you there's something really important here. But I think it's something that women don't really consider, or the kind of stay-at-home parent doesn't really consider. So if you're taking out, like if you're taking a career break, if you're going part-time so that you can look after a child, all of that's going to impact how much you're paying into your pension. And actually, if you're like quite part-time and your earnings drop below the threshold, it might even be that your employer doesn't have to contribute to your workplace pension. So you're getting like a double hit on that stuff, which means that women are like chronically underpensioned compared to men. By the time that they retire, they're so much more likely to be in like poverty in late life. And this is why I think there's maybe still a bit of a taboo around like going after his pension in the divorce. Like I think you sometimes hear, and it's slightly archaic, but women being like, even women saying like, oh gosh, she even went after his pension, when it's like he could get that pension because she was at home looking after the children that they both created. And that's very like sort of broad view of it, but it's true.
It's so interesting that your view on it is that there's a taboo, because my take on it is that women don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
And that women going through divorces don't actually realize that the pension, is normally worth as much as it is, especially if we're talking about divorces in like 40s, 50s. And also that they don't know that it is an asset that can be put on the table in a divorce, because there's just not the awareness around it. And I've spoken about this quite a lot with various different people. And I think one of the big challenges when it comes to divorces is that you normally see the assets that are most visible on the negotiating table. So for most people, that's going to be the property. And typically, and again, this is very stereotypical, but what happens is that you get the mother staying with the children in the family home, and the mother is more likely to want that family home and stability of that. So we'll prioritize that above everything else, either because they don't know about the value of the pension, or they just kind of push it aside and think like, oh, well, they can have the pension if I get the home. Again, not really digging into the detail of it. And that's really difficult to, I guess, undo, because as a mother, I understand that the priority probably in most cases is that stability for the children. And so you will say have the pension if it means that you can keep the kids in their home. And I can see why that is what happens so often. But from a financial perspective, I think 100% so many women are missing out because they aren't asking for that pension to be put on the table and to be discussed when they should be.
Yeah, definitely. So a real takeaway from this episode, I think, like always make sure the pension's on the table if you are going through a divorce, whether or not you've got children, in actual fact.
And I think on the point about children again as well, one thing that one of my friends and her husband do, so she hasn't been working for a couple of years because she has got 2 young children, and they chose for her not to go back to work immediately so that she could stay at home with the children, but her husband contributes to her pension. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily a case of, you know, people not wanting to do it. I do think sometimes in these conversations, the way they go is like, oh, the men are mean or the men are greedy. I think people don't know because they're not talking about it.
Yeah.
And they had the conversation about, okay, well, if I'm not going to go back to work, this is going to have a massive impact on my pension. So we need to contribute to that out of this household pot.
Yeah.
And that's what they do. But couples aren't having those conversations.
I think it's really baked in, and it's because we still, even in 2025, you know, there's loads of campaigns around this, but we're still not necessarily seeing like the value of the unpaid labor of raising a child. It's always like quite diminished. And, you know, it's kind of, you get quite a lot of like, oh, she's a stay-at-home mum or she doesn't work. And raising a child is very, very hard work. So I think what we need to do is, like, if you just shift the frame slightly, you see that actually the situation that's happening is you've got two people working incredibly hard.
Yeah.
One of them's getting paid for it and one isn't, but that joint income, it belongs to both of them. So of course, what is being contributed to pensions as a whole should be split equally between the two people who are like working together to create this situation. But so often, you're right, like it's split out of like, he does this and she just stays at home with the kids. And I think,
but is that society that does that, or why is it that we kind of go into that view of things? Because again, I don't buy that this is always the case, that men are seeing it like, oh, well, I'm the one at work, she's staying at home. Because I think a lot of men do appreciate that it's really, really hard work. And actually, in this situation, then this friend's husband has said, you know, I wouldn't want to do it. It's like, it's too hard. And so where is it coming from, this perception that staying at home is not really hard work?
I think it's just in our culture. Like I think we're at a really interesting point in all of this, and it's kind of like the convergence of loads of things, like you know, the rise of the trad wife, and kind of, I don't know, sort of, it comes up a lot in my feeds, even though I do not ask for it, of this kind of like really leaning back into the whole like 1950s like house setup.
I mean, it's a topic we could go into for a whole other episode, but like the thing I always think of when people say like, oh, a trad wife, I'm like, a trad wife like Nara Smith, who's earning far more money than her husband.
Trad wives has to be an episode at some point.
Okay,
maybe
we'll come back to that.
A bonus or something, because it is so interesting. And like, I'd love to talk about the shift in power dynamic when like their social following suddenly like tips the balance in the other direction. Like, I wonder what that does to those relationships.
Yeah.
But we are talking about Love is Blind. So are there any like other points that you think are really pertinent in this series, this like One UK series that we've had?
Yeah, I think the reunion is really fascinating, as I don't know about people watching, but there was one couple that everybody thought were going to make it. They got married. They seemed like it was all going well, Stephen and Sabrina. And we got to the reunion and they were sat on opposite sides of the room, and everyone thought, oh my gosh, what's happened here? And what proceeded to happen was quite an uncomfortable discussion and kind of interaction. And to kind of cut to the chase, a lot of people watching it took away from it that their relationship broke down because Stephen didn't like Sabrina being successful. And I have to admit that I have a bias in this, because one of my best friends is extremely good friends with Stephen. Okay. And so I have very much heard the behind the scenes on that side of things. So full transparency there. But I also listened to an episode that Louise, did with Stephen after the show, and they were talking about this on Louise's podcast and about the fact that it was just completely misinterpreted. The takeaway from the show that people saw, and obviously, again, we see so much of a highlights reel, like it's so edited. The perception was very much that he had basically not really put in the effort because he didn't have the money to go to visit her in Ireland, and she was setting up her own business, and she was doing really well, and he wasn't really supportive of this female independence. And they completely, in this podcast episode, debunk that and go into actually like the realities of what was going on. And I just think it's so fascinating that people were really quick to say like, oh, clearly this man is uncomfortable with this woman's success or ambition. But again, I feel like that's quite a gendered thing in that it's that idea that, I mean, setting aside the fact that it's not actually true, but I feel like we don't really see that the other way. In a way, it's almost looked at as a good thing in certain circles if a woman is like, you know, looking for an ambitious man. But then we assume that men are really uncomfortable with women being really successful and ambitious.
Yeah, and I do think this is something as well that we like put on, it's like a projection almost. Sometimes we can think of like men as like a concept.
Yeah.
But instead of thinking about like the men that we know and love, like I actually thinking about it, like my husband's always been really supportive of my any success that I've had.
Same.
Like other sort of men in my family have always like really supported their partners in being as successful as possible. And like if you're in a partnership, the success of one person is both of your success to a certain degree. So, I mean, I think that's fascinating. We'll have to put a link to that podcast episode in the show notes so that anyone who wants to hear the inside track, bit of behind the scenes, can listen. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about so much. We've covered so much ground, from like financial infidelity, financial compatibility. Should you get a prenup? Does it even matter anyway if you do? Hammer home that point on the pensions. Yeah, I suppose if we're going to have like a key takeaway from all of this, what do we think that it is?
I think for me, it would be, don't get blinded. Literally, don't get blinded by the excitement and the love and the lust, and let go of any of those question marks or red flags or just key issues that are so important to talk about in those early stages of a relationship. I'm not saying don't have fun, don't have all the excitement, but don't get to a point where it's too serious before you have some of those key conversations. Like, you don't need the pods to have those conversations.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be like pillow talk, does it? You can just like mention it when you're on a walk or whatever. No, I think it's the same for me. You know, I'm quite lucky in that, you know, we do have similar values, my husband and I, and like similar priorities, but that is just like blind luck. We're using a lot of blind references and I'm absolutely here for it. But yeah, I think being intentional with it and just like having a think about what is important to you, what's going to make you feel safe and secure, and what does compatibility look like for you when it comes to finances, because they are a really core part of the life that you're going to build together. And you can have all of the romantic stuff, all of the fluffy stuff, but money's quite a big part of the foundations.
Totally.
So I think that's about all we've got time for. But thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you liked it, please rate, review, and subscribe. Come find us on social media at Help Me I'm Podcast. and tell us, what did you think? What do you think on some of these issues? Some of them are quite contentious. Some of them, like Ellie and I, don't really know where we fall. We'd love to know what you think. Come find us there, and definitely tell a friend. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.